just record the main part of the talk. We'll then stop the recording after the main talk, so we can have a freely evolving discussion without fear of being saved to tape for posterity. And for those who haven't joined before, we have a slightly longer slot, an hour and a half, so that the main presentation will usually wrap up just before the hour mark, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. All right. Well, it's a real pleasure today to be hosting AdrienDoerig, and Adrien studied neuroscience and physics for his undergraduate training at EPFL, and completed his PhD in neuroscience under the supervision of Michael Herzog, who he's also collaborated with on a number of consciousness-related projects. And he's now based in Tim Keatsman's lab, which is a lab focusing on both artificial intelligence and human cognition. And his research there is focusing on developing neural network architectures and methods to study visual processing, and more broadly to understand how and when different computational properties of the visual system emerge. And many of us here will know Adrien for his work in consciousness science, both on the theoretical side and also on the empirical side, in terms of thinking carefully about how novel psychophysical approaches can shed light on foundational issues in consciousness science. And his talk today is entitled "What Long-Lasting Post-Diction Tells Us About Consciousness." I saw on Twitter that someone misread this as what a long-lasting postdoc tells us about consciousness. So maybe there's some truth in both of those, Adrien. I don't know. Anyway, the floor is yours, so please take it away.
There we go. Can everyone hear me all right? Cool, and you can see the screen?
Yep.
Wonderful. So thank you very much for the invitation. I really like the Consciousness Club, so I'm happy to be here. And thanks also for the very nice introduction. I wasn't expecting such a thorough introduction. So I had prepared a few slides just to present myself briefly. So my main work focus is on computational modeling of the visual system using deep neural networks. And I'm doing this with Tim Keatsman at the moment as a postdoc. Just as a few examples of what we do, we recently thought very intensely about how to use deep neural networks for neuroscience and why this might make sense. What's the research program around this? And we have this opinion piece coming out in Nature Reviews Neuroscience in a few weeks. So if you ever wondered what the hell people are doing with deep networks, like linking them to the brain, maybe that will be interesting. Another thing we did is to use, deep learning methods to look inside the visual system and see if we can decode semantic scene descriptions from various areas in the brain. And this has a recent preprint too, in which you might be interested. But today I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about my long-standing interest in consciousness science. And in particular, I want to tell you about some results that Michael Herzog, Leila Adrissi-Daoudi, and I collected about this phenomenon. And then I'll spend some time trying to think about what it tells us about theoretical issues in consciousness science. So let's dive right in. What do I mean by postdiction? Postdiction refers to paradigms in which a later stimulus influences perception of an earlier one. So one super clear-cut and simple example for which the effect is so strong that the first time I saw it, I thought my screen monitor had a problem, and it took me a long time to realize that, no, it's really the psychophysical effect, is color fusion. So color fusion is a super simple stimulation paradigm in which two colored dots are flashed for a few dozen milliseconds, for example, 30 milliseconds. The exact duration doesn't matter too much, at the same location on the screen. And what happens is that you perceive only a so-called fused percept, which is yellow. And if we change red and green, of course, we get different colors. So again, I present a red dot, then I present a green dot at the same location, and the percept is only a yellow dot. So you see that the fact that we present the green dot after the red dot changes the way we perceive the red dot. If the red dot was there alone, we'd super easily see it. It's not sub-threshold or anything weird like that. It's like crisp, easy to see. But when a green dot is presented afterwards, it changes the way we perceive the red dot. We don't see any red, we just see yellow. So that's post-diction. We were interested in this phenomenon, and we explored it using a paradigm called the sequential metacontrast paradigm, or SQM. And this is a simple psychophysics paradigm in which a series of vertical bars is presented, like depicted here, and this elicits the percept of two diverging motion streams, like so. So I'll show it again. Okay, so your subjects just perceive two diverging motion streams. And one neat thing about this paradigm is that if one of the streams has a little offset, as you can see here, then the offset is seen as transported along the motion stream. So now, you know, the offset information gets integrated with the moving bars, and you see a moving offset like this. Now, super important to note that this stimulus here, that you can see with two vertical bars with an offset, is called a Vernier stimulus. And so now in the future, whenever I say Vernier, I just mean two vertical bars with an offset. And usually subjects have to say if the bottom one is to the right or to the left. So here it would be right. All right. So to recap, in this SQM paradigm, when all the bars are straight, you see two straight moving bars. And when one of the bars is a Vernier, so when it has an offset, the offset is seen as transported along the motion stream. And here the colors are, of course, just for illustration. In the actual stimuli, everything is the same color. Now, it becomes interesting when we add more than one Vernier in this paradigm, and we ask, you know, how does the information, the offset information from this one later on, impact the information from the first one here? What happens is that intuitively they integrate. So if they have opposing offset directions, they cancel out, so to speak, and you cannot report any of their offset directions. You just see two moving bars. But if they have the same offset direction, they add up. And so the offset is easier to report. And this all seems sensible. And, you know, we know about integration in the brain. But the surprising thing is that when this first and second Verniers interfere, we only see the integrated percept, not the first Vernier and then the integrated percept. So it seems that the brain has to wait, in a sense, until the second Vernier appears to decide whether to perceive straight bars or bars with an offset. Okay, and this is a post-dictive effect. And in this case, it's lasting pretty long already. In the color fusion example, it was just 30 milliseconds, but now here it's 130 milliseconds. So all of this was developed in Michael Herzog's lab before my time by Thomas Otto. And he showed this effect, basically. And we wanted to know how long can we push it? And also, very importantly, we wanted to know whether or not it's mandatory. So one trivial explanation for this effect is that maybe subjects are just confused. And so they sometimes randomly report the first or the second Vernier. And so it looks like they cannot see it, but in fact, they see both. So we wanted to check for that and see how long, checking for this, the effect can last. So we conducted the obvious experiment, which is to just have a very long stream of elements. And there were two Verniers, and the second Vernier could be presented at different times. And the question is, sure, if I present the second Vernier next Christmas, you'll see them separately, but how far apart can they be so that they integrate? That's the question. And to check, to make sure it's mandatory, we told subjects everything about the stimulus. So we said, all right, there's going to be two, we showed them this picture, and we said there's going to be two motion streams, and there's going to be a Vernier stimulus in the center at the beginning. So allocate all your attentional resources to this one. There will be a second one later on, but it doesn't matter. Just try to report this one. So now if they cannot report it, they're allocating all their attentional resources in the right way, and it seems like it will be mandatory. And I'm not going to show you the nitty-gritty psychophysical details for this particular experiment for the sake of time, but I will tell you the take-home message, which is that we found mandatory integration, in this sense, up to 450 milliseconds for half of the observers, and at least up to 290 for the other half. So in other words, this is a super striking result, I think, because two visual elements presented as far apart as almost half a second are not perceived individually, and only the outcome of integration is perceived. So in this sense, post-diction seems to last for hundreds of milliseconds. So perception seems to wait in the sense that I described earlier for hundreds of milliseconds, and that's very long. What's more, this is a very large and qualitative effect on discrimination. It's not just a tiny effect that we talk about because it's significant, but maybe it's so small that it doesn't really impact perception. No, it goes from 75% accuracy on reporting the Vernier offset, which is how we calibrate it in the beginning when the Vernier is presented alone, all the way down to chance level when a second Vernier is presented 300 milliseconds later. That's a super large qualitative effect on perception. And in addition, it's a discrimination task. So it cannot be explained by some criterion effect where subjects might be biased towards saying that they don't see something or something like that. Here, they're really unable to report this simple offset feature. So I think all of this hints to the fact that we're tapping into something relevant with this stimulus paradigm. And our results are not the only results that showed long-lasting post-diction, so I'll just review a few others that go in the same direction. The first line of research that goes in the same direction is by the lab of Claire Sergent, where they showed multiple times in multiple ways that a cue presented hundreds of milliseconds after an initial stimulus can post-dictively make the stimulus conscious, so bring it into consciousness. Typically, the way it works is that a very faint threshold level stimulus is presented in one of two locations. Here it's this Gabor. And then they wait for various amounts of time, in this case, 300 milliseconds, 250 milliseconds. And then they can cue either the valid location where the stimulus actually was or the invalid location where the stimulus wasn't. And through some clever psychophysics, they can show that when the cue is valid, it sort of brings back the stimulus into consciousness, even if it wouldn't have been perceived without the cue. So here, a cue presented 300 milliseconds after the stimulus changes the way we perceive the stimulus. So it's also a post-dictive effect. Another example is this paper by Sharonovsky and colleagues, where they used a fusion paradigm with Verniers. So you remember earlier, I was talking about color fusion, where if you show red then green, you just perceive yellow. Well, similarly with Verniers, if you flash them one after the other for a few dozen milliseconds, then the percept is one Vernier with the intermediate offset. And here they showed that by using TMS at different times after the stimulus was off the screen, they could change the offset direction perceived by subjects. So this is, again, a post-dictive effect with the small difference that now the post-dictive stimulus is a TMS pulse instead of some visual information. And again, it lasts for hundreds of milliseconds, and it starts to really, be dead at 370 milliseconds. So again, the same order of time. And the last piece of evidence that I'll mention, although there are a few more, is a research by the lab of Stan de Haan, where they were interested in a set of experiments in at which time can you decode from EEG or MEG or imaging whether a given target stimulus will be consciously perceived or not. And here it's an example with masking. So there's a target and then a mask, and subjects have to report it. And they have to report whether they see it or not. And basically what they show is that you cannot decode whether the stimulus will be seen or not for hundreds of milliseconds. So this also points to this long-lasting unconscious processing time window in which it's not yet determined what will be perceived. So there's this long-lasting period, apparently, where the percept is not determined yet, and things that happen within this unconscious processing time window can alter the percept, even though they're presented after the initial stimulus. So all of this points to the idea that long-lasting post-diction shows that perception of a first element can depend on a second element presented hundreds of milliseconds later. During this time, the first element is represented since it influences the post-dictive percept, but it's not perceived. So conscious perception seems to wait for hundreds of milliseconds, during which time complex and conscious processes can occur. And there's converging evidence for this from different paradigms. Okay, so that's the sort of central idea of long-lasting post-diction that I wanted to present. And in the remaining time, I'll explore some theoretical implications of this. So I'll take for granted that all these results are solid. I think they are, but you never know. So let's take for granted that they are and see what we can, what follows. Sorry, I'll just drink some tea. So the first topic that I think long-lasting post-diction can teach us about is the temporal structure of consciousness. What do I mean by that? Well, when I say temporal structure of consciousness, I refer to the age-old debate of whether perception is continuous or discrete. It seems intuitively that consciousness is a continuous stream of percept, so that here we have a diver jumping off a cliff. Our conscious contents are sort of a stream, a continuous stream. They change constantly. But an alternative set of theories actually thinks that this is not true, and in fact that consciousness may be a temporally discrete process, where the idea is that you sort of take information over a certain time scale into account, the brain computes a sort of percept based on this, then you perceive it as a snapshot, although snapshot is a bit of a simplification, but we can say it now, a snapshot, and then we move on to the next chunk and get another snapshot. So is consciousness a continuous stream, or is it made of discrete snapshots? That's the question. So post-diction, as it turns out, challenges continuous theories. And I'd like to illustrate this with this color fusion experiment that I mentioned earlier, because it's nice and simple. Of course, a continuous theory can explain that there is integration. A continuous theory might say, well, we continuously perceive the outcome of processing in the last 100 milliseconds, for example. That works. So right now we're at this time, and in the past 100 milliseconds, both stimuli were presented, and so they get integrated, and I perceive yellow. This is easy to explain for continuous theories. But the problem is that they predict too many percepts, and I will illustrate this with a little GIF I made. So here's the GIF. You can see that if the window of integration is continuously sliding, you would predict that first only the green disk is in the integration window, so you perceive green. Then both disks are in the window, so you perceive yellow, and then only the red disk is in the integration window. So for this reason, but this is not what we perceive, right? What we perceive is only a yellow disk, and it's a super, super crisp percept. So if perception were really continuous, we should see something greenish, and then something yellow, and then something reddish, and then a transition between them. But it's really like extremely clearly not what we perceive when we do color fusion. We only see yellow. So that's the too many percepts problem, and I think it's a reasonably strong challenge for continuous theories of consciousness. Because they cannot explain why we don't perceive the first stimulus, basically, in all post-dictive effects. So this favors discrete theories, and let's see if we can find some direct experimental evidence for this. So we are, of course, not the first people to think about discrete theories of consciousness. There's a very nice review by Van Rullen in 2016, where he reviews some empirical evidence for the idea. But his ideas are more centered around brain oscillations, and the idea is that everything that's presented between two peaks, for example, of an oscillation gets bundled together into one discrete percept. But we're looking for something on a longer scale, because I just showed you that post-dictive effects can last up to 300 milliseconds. So that's too long for brain oscillations. So we're going to see if this even is detectable in experiment. Can we find evidence for discrete perception on the order of hundreds of milliseconds? And we did that again with this SQM paradigm, except that this time we made it more complicated, and we had three stimuli, three verniers three offsets in the stream. And the question is, what gets integrated with what? In a continuous theory, the last two should integrate more strongly than the first two because they're closer in space and time. But in a discrete theory, where first you process information in this discrete time window and then move to the next discrete time window, then the second Vernier should be released from integration. It should be easy to detect, right? Even though it's closer to this one, it's part of a different window according to our previous results, so it should be easy to report. And this is what we tested. So here I'll show you a bit more detailed results. We had 9 subjects and they all did this task in lots of conditions. The conditions are depicted on the x-axis and they have complicated names, but don't worry because I'm going to show you the exact condition all the time here on the left. The y-axis is what we call the dominance level, but essentially it's a measure of the % correct observers got when they tried to report a particular Vernier's orientation. So when there's a single Vernier here at the beginning, they're able to report the offset orientation 75% of the time, because that's how we calibrate the offset size. We want to avoid ceiling and floor effects. So we calibrate the offset size using a staircase procedure so that they're correct 75% of the time. When there is a single Vernier later on in the stream, we also calibrate it so that they get it right 75% of the time. It's just shown in the negative because that's, it will make sense when I show you the next results. Okay, next we sort of replicate the first experiment that I talked to you about by having 2 Verniers at different times in the stream. When they are part of the same sort of window of integration, based on our estimates from in the previous experiment, observers are not able, we ask observers to report the last Vernier in the stream, and they cannot do it. They're at chance level. So this is similar to what we found earlier. But when the Verniers are further apart, then they can super easily report the second Vernier. Okay, so this basically replicates what we found earlier. And now the crucial experiment comes where we have 3 Verniers in the stream, and we will ask first to report the first Vernier in the stream and then the last Vernier in the stream. And you see that when we ask them to report the first Vernier, their performance drops super strongly. It's not exactly chance level this time, but there's a very serious drop. So it seems that reporting this Vernier is very hard, even though it's far from the second one. On the other hand, when they have to report the last one, they can super easily do it. Okay, so I know this is a lot of results, but I prepared a summary to get the idea across. And the summary is that the first 2 Verniers here, they integrate across 330 milliseconds and a large spatial distance. But these 2, the last 2, they do not integrate, even though they are much, much closer in space and time, about twice as close, actually. So this suggests that we find evidence for integration in discrete time windows lasting hundreds of milliseconds, and elements integrate only if they are in the same window, regardless of their spatial proximity. And then we pushed this a bit further, and here I will not show you the psychophysical details because otherwise we'd still be here in a week. But we had super long streams of elements covering 2 of these 300-ish millisecond time windows, and there could be up to 6 of these Verniers in the stream, so it's a very complicated setup. And long story short, what we found is that all the Verniers within a window, a discrete window, influence each other. They integrate in the first window and in the second window, but they don't influence each other across windows. So what matters for integration is really belonging to this same discrete temporal window. It's not really how spatiotemporally close stimuli are per se. It's really which window they're in. So just to make the point one last time, our idea is that when you have long streams of elements that may or may not integrate together, what happens is that when the stimulus starts, a window of unconscious processing opens, and everything within this window will be blended into one percept that occurs at the end of the window. And then a second window opens, and the same occurs for the second part of the stimulus. So it's easy in this case to report this Vernier, but you cannot report these 2, because this one is alone in its window, but these 2 get sort of positively mixed. Okay. So we saw that because of this too many percepts problem that I described earlier. Continuous theories have a problem, so this favors discrete theories. And we even found direct evidence for long-lasting discrete time windows of perception in our experiment. So maybe we're done. Maybe we just proved that consciousness is discrete. But this is not so, because discrete theories also face their own problems. The main one has to do with the time scale of these discrete conscious episodes. If you have the right time scale for a stimulus, you have a discrete discrete window of integration with no stimuli, so you perceive nothing. Then both stimuli are in the window, so you perceive the integrated percept, in this case yellow, and then nothing again. So if you're at the right time scale, you can easily explain post-diction as a discrete theory. But as soon as the time scale is a bit off, you get the same problem as continuous theories. For example, if you sample, so to speak, the conscious percept too often, then you also predict too many percepts. Okay. And this is a problem because, as it turns out, if you review the literature on post-dictive effects, they cover a huge range of temporal timescales. Some are on the order of 5 milliseconds, and some, as we just saw, are on the other order of 400 milliseconds. And the color fusion example I showed you is on the other order of maybe 50 milliseconds. So we have 2 orders of magnitude of frequency of like spatial resolution, temporal resolutions in these effects. So it seems that there is no consistent duration for discrete percepts. And that's quite a big problem. So to put the problem a bit differently, we consciously can resolve different timescales in different paradigms. So these different paradigms seem to each require a different frequency for discrete conscious updates. And so that's weird. It's especially weird since a lot of stuff can happen during post-diction. I showed you that short-range spatio-temporal integration can occur in color fusion. We had long-range spatio-temporal integration and segregation of multiple elements in the SQM. This even works across saccades, and it even works when we have occluders in the stream, and there are different colors. And so it's all very complex stuff going on. It can even happen cross-modally, as Claire Sergent has shown, and even volitional effects can occur. So we have all these different processes, each coming with a different time scale. And so it seems that we cannot find a coherent time scale for discrete percepts. Unless, we thought, unless we just take the longest one. Maybe discrete percepts occur really quite rarely. And it's just that all these different processes shown here, they all occur unconsciously before the discrete percept. So that's our way out of this conundrum. So we proposed a 2-stage model for consciousness in which all of these highly spatio-temporally precise processes happen unconsciously, and the conscious percept occurs later at a discrete moment of time. And each of these unconscious processes has a different time scale, but the conscious update has a coherent, slower time scale on the order of a few hundred milliseconds. And then we speculated a bit about why it might be a few hundred milliseconds. One idea is that it's the typical time between 2 eye movements. So it's an ecologically valid, or relevant time scale for integration for the brain. So yeah, but all this is very speculative. So basically the idea is as follows. You have lots of super precise and complex unconscious processes, and then later you perceive the outcome of all these processes. So for example, you have a color fusion stimulus. Each of these dots is registered, represented in the brain, and blended together into a fused percept by unconscious processes. You haven't perceived any of this yet, and only at the end of a few hundred milliseconds, you perceive the outcome of this unconscious processing. Then maybe there's the stimulus of Claire Sergent's lab. You have a very faint stimulus that's registered by unconscious processes, but you don't perceive it yet. And then it might get boosted or suppressed later on by the cue, but you still don't perceive it. And when the discrete snapshot occurs after a few hundred milliseconds, then if the cue and the stimulus interact in the right way, you perceive the outcome of this and you see it. And the same happens with the SQM in the way that I explained earlier. So that's our idea. So in conclusion of this first part about the temporal structure of consciousness, I tried to show that there are long-lasting windows of very complex unconscious processing. And the SQM provides direct evidence that these windows are temporally discrete. To explain these results, we propose that conscious perception may have a two-stage temporal structure with continuous and precise unconscious processes followed by discrete conscious updates. And this solves the too many percepts problem of continuous theories because it's discrete. And it also solves the paradox of multiple temporal resolutions because basically there's only one very slow temporal resolution. That's the conclusion of the first part. In the second part, I collaborated with Matthias Michel, and we thought about what all this might mean for the debate between local and global theories of consciousness. Because there's a very striking, I think, so why we started thinking of this is that there's this very striking finding that things seem to be represented in complex ways for extended durations, but you don't perceive them. You only perceive the outcome of all of this unconscious processing after a very long time. So we thought this is relevant for the local versus global theories of consciousness debate. Okay, let's dive into this part. And I like to illustrate the distinction between local and global theories using an example, and it's a change blindness example. So given this audience, I think probably most people know what change blindness is, but we'll still see if you know this particular example. It's always fun. And I don't know if it works through the internet. So the idea is that if you haven't seen this demos before, it's very difficult to see what changes in this demos. Now, if I attract your attention to the background color behind this gentleman here, you'll see that it changes color. This is quite striking, right? Because there's a very massive change in visual information, like on your fovea, more or less. And each of these frames is presented for hundreds of milliseconds. I mean, we know that this is like more than enough time for your sensory cortices to process them. Yet you don't see it. How? That's strange. And there's two main lines of explanation. The first is that, as we just saw, the information about the color is well represented in your sensory cortices. So actually you perceive it. And that's the localist idea. Since the color is well represented in your sensory cortices, if you're a local theory, you basically state actually you perceive it. And I have to explain why you don't notice it kind of as a later problem. So local theories say when it's well represented in sensory cortices, you perceive the change. Global theories, on the other hand, mainly, most famously, global workspace theory or higher order thought theory, would say, well, since you didn't notice the change, maybe you weren't conscious of it in the first place, and that may be explained by the fact that consciousness maybe requires the global, interaction of lots of brain processes that likely cover many parts of the brain and interact in a more complex way. It's not enough to just represent things properly in sensory cortices. You need to do something with these representations. So that's the global account. So they would say because of this, you didn't actually see the color change. So this global versus local debate, I think, is really quite important because it has far-reaching consequences. As we just saw, localists and globalists predict different percepts in many cases and link consciousness with very different brain regions. So because of these strong differences, we can potentially hope to settle this debate a bit more easily than other more fraught issues in consciousness science, and this would be a major step forward. So now we'll see how long-lasting post-diction challenges local theories. So just to make it crystal clear, the core claim of local theories is that a perceptual feature is consciously experienced when it's appropriately represented in sensory systems. And what appropriately means, basically, is the distinction between different local theories. So for different local theories, appropriately represented means different things. The most famous of these theories is the recurrent processing theory by Victor Lemme, according to which appropriately represented means being recurrently processed between sensory areas. And this we know from physiology occurs around 100 to 200 milliseconds. And this time scale is super important for the argument, okay? So the idea is to be appropriately represented. It just means, according to this theory, it entails that it just means to be normally processed for a few hundred milliseconds, 100 or 200 milliseconds. And there's some evidence to back up these theories. Usually they have the following form. We have a contrast between a seen and an unseen stimulus. And the idea is to show that when the stimulus is seen, there is recurrent processing going on, but not when it's not seen. So here's an example. There's a figure ground stimulus here, and they recorded the activity of neurons that have the receptive field on this figure here. When it's seen, when it's in monkeys, so when the monkey reports seeing this figure, there is some recurrent modulation of the activity going on. But when they mask it and the monkey doesn't report seeing the figure, then the recurrent modulation goes away. So this, kind of supports the idea that recurrence is linked to consciousness in this paradigm. But the question is whether recurrent processing is really sufficient for creating conscious percepts, or if we can find cases instead where stimuli undergo extensive recurrent processing without being perceived. And I think you see where this is going, because in long-lasting post-addiction, we have exactly this. We ask observers to focus all of their attentional resources on this central vernier, and then we see that the post-addictive effect can last more than 290 milliseconds. And so here's the formal description of the problem. We know that when the first vernier is presented alone, it's easy to report. So it's well represented, and its representation is not being destroyed by the later bars here. The information is alive and well. But when we present, all we change is one of these little bars here. 290 milliseconds later, it post-actively determines the percept. So the first vernier is represented normally for more than 300 milliseconds without being perceived. But by then, it has been thoroughly recurrently processed, since we saw that recurrent processing occurs around 100 to 200 milliseconds. And this contradicts the core claim of local theories, because we have, I think, a pretty clear case of a feature being represented but not perceived. Represented in sensory cortices, properly, but not perceived. So I think that's pretty problematic. Of course, there's a powerful and classic localist counter-argument to this sort of evidence, which is based on phenomenal overflow. So to get our ideas straight about what phenomenal overflow is, let's go back to this change blindness example. You remember that the color change was right there in the center of your visual field for hundreds of, half a second at a time, yet you didn't really notice it. What might happen, and it's kind of intuitively sensible, I think, is that you have this super rich and complicated conscious percept, and maybe you kind of, in a sense, saw the color changing, but you didn't notice it. Maybe you were paying attention to other parts of your conscious percept or something like this. And that's the idea of overflow. There was actually a change between these two frames in your consciousness, and you just were paying attention to the wrong kind of part of this conscious percept, so you didn't notice it. Ultimately, I think it doesn't work personally, but I see the intuition, and that's, I think, the intuition. And so this can avoid all the kinds of problems that I mentioned, because you might argue, actually, subjects did consciously perceive the first vernier, it's just that it overflowed, so they couldn't report it. And then the problem vanishes. So in that paper with Mathias Michel, we thought it's important to contrast two different versions of overflow. One is sensible and doesn't work to avoid our argument, and the other one is not sensible and doesn't work to it does work, to avoid our argument. So you have to be unsensible, I think, to avoid our argument. That's the point. The sensible version of overflow we call weak overflow. And this is just the idea, as I just explained, that subjects may fail to report a consciously experienced target when they don't attend to it. Maybe they were distracted, maybe attention was overloaded or directed to the wrong place, and so on. And this may be a good interpretation for change blindness, as we just saw. That's weak overflow. And this should be contrasted with strong overflow, which is the idea that subjects may fail to report a consciously experienced task-relevant target, even if they attend to it. Okay, so this would mean in the change blindness example that even after I point you to the part of the image that was changing, and you were trying as hard as you could to see the change with all the relevant information in your possession, you would still not notice it, but strong overflow would say that you actually still experience it, you know? And I think that's pretty weird. And this is what is required in this particular case, because subjects are sitting there devoting all their perceptual resources to trying to report this super simple value, yet they still cannot report it. So you need this very strong version of overflow to avoid the argument that we mentioned. And I think this is highly problematic, personally. The first reason is that strong overflow is really counterintuitive, because it seems weird to say that we are really utterly incapable of knowing what we experience, even when we try it as hard as we can. Second, proponents of local theories usually do not seem to subscribe to strong overflow. Here's a quote by Victor Lama saying, "It is safe to assume invisibility in masking because there is no conceivable reason that could prevent the subject from reporting his visual percept that he had one. The subject is sitting there focusing his full attention to the target location, ready to push the button as soon as he sees the target." This is exactly what we do in our experiments. So it seems that even localists are, in their standard way of thinking, ready to accept our conclusions. And there's a very good reason for this, because if you don't trust the results of experiments of this kind, like, for example, masking is one of them, then you would nullify the whole evidence supporting local theories in the first place. You remember I showed you this one example of some evidence claimed to support local theories, which was based on a contrast between when monkeys reported seeing or not seeing a target. Well, if you just try to get away from problems by saying, well, in these cases, not reported is not the same as not consciously perceived, you basically destroy this contrast. And so the evidence supporting the local theory in the first place crumbles. So that's it. For the second part, we saw that the core claim of local theories is that a feature is consciously perceived when it is adequately represented in sensory cortices. But long-lasting postdiction seems, I think, to show that this is just not what happens. You can have a stimulus that is adequately represented, even though it's not consciously perceived. And this contradicts the core claim of local theories. You could avoid this problem if you adopt a very strong version of overflow, but that will nullify the empirical support for local theories. And so I think it makes this challenge super difficult to avoid. So I'll wrap up now. I'm almost done. In general, I try to convince you that long-lasting postdictive effects convincingly show that perception of a first element can depend on a second element presented hundreds of milliseconds later, and this favors temporally discrete theories of consciousness. We went over some experimental results showing direct empirical evidence for long-lasting discrete time windows in conscious perception. And lastly, we also saw how long-lasting postdictive effects pose a challenge for local theories of consciousness. And with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and the funding and all of you for the invitation and your attention. And feel free to contact me if you want to chat about any of this at any time. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Adrien, for a fantastic talk. We should first unmute and give you a round of applause. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's overwhelming.
We're going to use the well, first I should stop the recording.